What's up guys, welcome to a new video, and in this video I'm going to be talking about my genuine thoughts after having owned the Insta360 X5 for about a month now and having used it quite regularly. If you've watched any of my other videos, you've actually seen some behind the scenes content having been shot on the X5, and I'm working on a full proper review on it, but I wanted to give you my genuine thoughts on it first. So it might help you decide whether you want to pick one of these up or whether you want to go and look at another camera, for instance. Full disclosure, Insta360 did send me this camera and a bunch of accessories to review and to make videos about, but there has been no conversation on the direction that these videos go. Of course, if I completely trash this camera, they probably won't send me another one, but I think they're genuinely quite confident in how good the camera is, that they were happy for me to speak my mind, and I really appreciate that. The dialogue with Insta360 has been very honest. I talked to them about some of the flaws of this camera that I've found. One of them apparently can be fixed in a firmware update, and they're doing those regularly. So I'm pretty happy about how they're listening to feedback and responding to it and acknowledging some areas where this could be improved for the next version. So that being said, let's get into it. What are my genuine thoughts about this 360 camera? And kind of what were my thoughts about 360 cameras prior to this? Well, to give you some context, I had the Insta360 X3 prior to that, and prior to that I had the GoPro Max. And for me, the Insta360 X3 was a huge jump up from the GoPro Max, mostly because of the integration with the Insta360 app. I could see people filming something on this camera, using the app really quickly and posting something on social media. And with the GoPro app, I found it so much more tedious to get something from camera to posting on social media. And they haven't changed that. I have heard some other users with the X5 complaining about the new app, saying it's a bit more cluttered. I think they got used to the previous app that they were using for their other models. They've updated it since then. But personally, I've found it to be pretty easy. There are two little editing modes that are quite confusing sometimes. But for general recomposing and stuff like that, I find the app on the phone relatively easy to use. That being said, desktop app as well has been improved with right-click keyframing to help you reframe your image a lot more smoothly. And I actually think that that process is a lot smoother than it was prior as well. That's getting into the kind of editing side of it, but that is an issue with these 360 cameras, or at least a barrier, let's say. The beauty of these cameras is the fact that it captures, of course, everything around you, but the downside is that the reality, right now we're posting everything in 16:9 most of the time, or 9:16 for social media. So we're going to have to compose that. Now, the X5 has introduced a lot of features in the camera itself to help you both capture 360 content and a reframed tracked version of yourself, for instance, which is super handy. And there are AI tools in the software, but that is always a challenge with 360 cameras. Having to, how much extra work do you want to put in the post-processing? And I honestly think Insta360 have made it just about as easy as possible with their AI tracking and reframing tools. So what are the other major upgrades from something like the X3 or the X4? Well, if you haven't seen before, it has a bigger sensor, better AI chips, has a bigger lens. And the big one is the fact that these are replaceable lenses. With my X3, I had this thing mounted to, or the X3 mounted to my handlebars when I did this crazy road trip. And I was going off-road, the mount that I had this connected to snapped, and the camera hit some rocks on a dirt road and scratched the lens permanently. With this, that's not an issue. You can just switch them out, which is really good. And the lenses are a relatively reasonable price to switch them out. At least you're not losing your action camera, because that is what these are marketed as, 360 action cameras. So it's nice that we actually have a peace of mind when using these in a more rugged environment. So beyond that, what about the image quality? Insta360 have claimed to have better low light with this, overall better image quality from this 360 X5. So is that true? First of all, I will say, yes, it absolutely is true. There's no doubt about it. When you put this side by side from the X3, the video quality is so much better. But what I think a lot of people don't really think about is they see that this is 8K and the X4 is 8K and the X3 is 5.7K. Well, that is not the output. I mean, technically it kind of is, because the 360 file is that resolution. But when you're realistically going to output it, you're going to crop into a section of that 360 image, which is therefore going to give you a lower resolution final output. And with the X3, that ended up being around 1080p. So with the X5 now, you're looking at closer to a 4K output. And there are a few YouTube channels out there that have gone really into meticulous detail, and I think they kind of came to a conclusion that the final output is more like 2.7K or something like that, but don't hold me to that. The point is that although it says 8K, you're not getting a crazy 8K image that you're going to be able to put straight onto your TV. It's the whole thing. So then what does that mean for the final output? If you are going to crop to a 16:9 portion of this camera, how does that turn out? I'll be honest with you, the image quality isn't as high as something like the DJI Osmo Pocket 3 that I'm filming this on, but also you have to understand that it's a much smaller sensor, and it's also kind of in a completely different category. Now, that being said, I have been trying to see how this does fit into a similar category as the Osmo Pocket 3, aka a daily vlogging camera that can also capture my entire surroundings. So in that scenario, this thing is closer than it's ever been to a daily vlogging camera. And I honestly think that you could use this if you were going to go traveling and you were in an interesting scenario and you had some interesting content, maybe you're an interesting personality. I think that you could just take this and get away with creating some really exciting and interesting and unique travel content with this, especially as the X5 pairs with the new Insta360 Mic Air. And it pairs very seamlessly as well, and I've done a video on that. So technically you could then go through and vlog, and you could record your whole surroundings, and you almost have unlimited shots. You could output your talking head shot, and then you could output whatever the other side of the camera is as well, which makes it quite cool. Of course, once again, that's gonna mean that you're gonna have to have a little bit more of a post-production workflow. It's gonna take longer because then you have to output those. Insta360 does have some AI tools that will allow you to automatically pull different angles straight from this camera. So that is an option. And it's honestly something I've never seen before, and it's something that I would like to try, is to do some travel vlogging with just this. So that leads us on to the next thing. One of the things with vlogging cameras is that you kind of want to have them to be, well, A, compact, but also be versatile enough to work in all sorts of lighting environments. And traditionally, action cameras, which this is one of them as well, are not very good in low light. Insta360 have kind of done something with their software and slightly bigger sensors with their Ace Pro series to create a lot better enhanced low light capabilities. And they've since introduced some of that into the X5. And I have to say, it is quite amazing how well this does in low light, given the fact that its predecessors were pretty bad in low light. And I've done a little bit of a comparison with this. So low light improvement has come. It is definitely slightly muddy and blocky, especially when it gets really, really dark. You can tell there's a lot of processing done to it. But what do you really want to get out of a camera like this in that scenario? And I think that that's something that we don't really ask ourselves too much. We focus so much on megapixels and quality, and yes, the higher the quality, the better the image, the more immersive the stuff is going to be, but also it's the content as well. And this thing can allow you to get content that I think a lot of bigger sensor cameras cannot get you. I think that in many scenarios, if you were to take this into a low light environment where there's a lot of people, the fact this is quite discreet will be beneficial to you. I guess my point is that muddiness in the low light could be overlooked. It's clear enough that as long as you get an idea of what the content is or the concept is, it would still be usable, especially as it's way more practical than having something like a big DSLR. Take from that whatever you wish, but I guess my point is that quality of the content is more important than necessarily image quality. So recently, they also did a firmware upgrade to this camera so that in single lens mode, which is a mode of the camera where it just allows you to use a single lens, there's pure video mode with that as well, which is their low light mode. And that's another thing that I've been curious about with these action cameras. It's like, okay, so 8K for the entire sensor, so one sensor should be 4K thereabouts. The output of one of these lenses should be pretty much equivalent to something like another action camera with a similar size sensor. So have I found that to be true? Well, not quite. I don't think it's quite as good as it is right now as something like a dedicated GoPro or a Action 5 Pro. And I think the Action 5 Pro has a slightly bigger sensor. Perhaps you could compare that as well to the Ace Pro, although I have never used it. Ace Pro definitely has a larger sensor, but still the single lens mode I don't think is quite as good as a dedicated action camera at this point. Is it good enough that having just one camera that does it all, does that make it worth it? Would I be comfortable enough to go traveling with this without my other camera? And I think the answer is yes, I would. I don't think I'd be comfortable leaving my Osmo Pocket 3 at home because I really like using this for slightly higher quality videos. I like the fact that it has a blurrier background, and I like the focal length as well. This, you're pretty much stuck to a very wide focal length. If you start to zoom in much, the quality of the image deteriorates because essentially you're cropping into a sensor. I don't think it will replace an Osmo Pocket 3, but I do think you could get away with having this and no action camera. Which leads us to another point, the form factor. This form factor is definitely quite different to an action camera. Action cameras are quite square and a lot smaller than this, or at least about half the size of this, maybe a little bit wider. That is kind of a downside. Also, these lenses protrude a little bit more than an action camera would be, so it's a little bit less discreet and I would say slightly less convenient to film with. However, if you hold it like this, actually, you could argue about that with the form factor. So I think, yes, you could use this as your only action camera at this point. But one thing I have noticed is I use the mouth mount a lot with my action cameras whenever I'm doing kite surfing, for instance. And I can just bite onto the float, or I can have a little mouth mount. Doesn't protrude that much. But by the time you screw this action camera or the Insta360 to a mouth mount, it kind of hangs down like right here. And my harness is here and there's a bar and a bunch of other stuff. So it doesn't really capture it super well, which means that I have to then turn it upside down, and then it ends up with a mouth mount. It ends up right kind of in front of my in front of my vision, and I go cross-eyed whilst using it. And there's a lot of weight on my mouth there. Now there are mounts that allow you to mount this sideways and do a mouth mount like that, which I haven't tried yet, but I think would be the solution. And Insta360 does have a chest mount for the single lens mode as well, that you can also buy, that I also haven't tried. But that's one thing to bear in mind. If you're used to using the biting motion for point of view shots, this is slightly unwieldy when it comes to that. Battery life is pretty good. They've also got a new extended battery that's going to come out as well, which will improve the battery life of this. It has fast charging, which means it charges quite quickly. So in 4K, single lens mode, it goes up to 60 frames per second. And then if we drop down to 1080p, it'll go to 120 frames per second. So those are your options. If you want 120, you're stuck at 1080p. If you want 4K, you can go up to 60 frames per second on single lens mode. Let's look at 360 mode. Okay, so if we want to go up to 60 frames per second, we have to drop down to 5.7K. And then if you want 120, it'll do 4K 120. But remember, that's the full 360. So the output of half of that will be about 2K, something like that. But you're probably going to crop in on that as well to stop it from being distorted, so who knows. Anyway, that's the modes that we have here. There are all sorts of other modes, tracking modes, the mode, like I said earlier, where it will output a 360 image, as well as a 16:9 or 9:16 image as well. But that is at 1080p, that output. What else do we have? Time lapse, motion lapse, tracking. This thing is an absolute beast. Microphone integration. So I would say that I'm very happy with this X5. I think it's definitely a huge improvement from the X3 and a pretty big improvement from the X4, looking at some of the specs of the other ones. One other thing I didn't mention, it now has a quick release mechanism or compatibility. I haven't used that yet either, but I think that would be super handy if you were to like kind of pop it onto a chest mount and pop it onto a helmet mount. This thing I think is now finally, truly an action camera that you could also use for some vlogging, great for behind the scenes footage as well, and actually usable now in YouTube videos, whereas prior to this, it was kind of only really valuable for vertical social media. So that is the Insta360 X5, my first thoughts after having used this. If you want to buy it, I have an affiliate link down below. I would love it if you could use that. Subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any questions about this camera, let me know. I'm going to do a full review with all sorts of different examples of footage that I've used it in the next video or in the next couple videos. I'll see you guys in the next one. Thanks for watching.